unbelievable collapse. This is what it looks like when a superpower unravels in real time. Once a dominant force on the global stage, Russia is sliding backwards fast. Bartering has returned, the economy is cracking, and the Kremlin is clawing at the past to survive the present. With oil experts plunging, sanctions tightening, and no end in sight to the war in Ukraine, Russia's breakdown is picking up speed. It's a humiliating, almost surreal fall from grace for the world's largest country. Backed by its rich array of natural resources, including the largest supplies of oil and natural gas on the planet, plus the second largest supply of coal, 22% of the world's forests, and huge quantities of tin, iron, platinum and nickel, among other elements, Russia has historically been able to enjoy an exceptionally strong position as far as international trade is concerned. For generations, it hasn't had to actively seek out trade partners or make concessions when striking deals with nations around the globe. Instead, it's been able to sit back and relax as countries far and wide compete for its attention, investment, and resources. But that's all starting to change. Recent reports from a variety of news organizations, including Reuters, have revealed that Russia is reviving the age-old bartering system, offering goods like wheat and seeds in exchange for other products like Chinese cars and construction materials. This is perhaps the most dramatic sign of the country's economic collapse so far. Barter is one of the world's oldest economic exchange systems, dating all the way back to the days of ancient Stone Age civilizations like Mesopotamia in 6000 BC, where tribes would exchange the likes of grain, livestock and lumber with each other. This system functioned well enough in a much simpler, older world, where the concept of money was not yet developed or widespread. These days, however, the use of barter is almost non-existent in almost all developed countries, and even poorer emerging nations have largely moved on from this ancient practice. But while most countries are leaving barter in the history books, Russia is instead embracing it, not out of any specific national desire to bring bartering back, but out of necessity. And it all ties back to Western sanctions. Since the war began, numerous nations around the Western world have imposed successive waves of financial sanctions against Russian banks, businesses, oligarchs, and government officials. The country has been cut off from the SWIFT international payment system, for example, making it much more difficult for funds to flow in or out of Russia to and from other countries across the world. Initially, Russia found ways to manage and maintain its economic standing, even under the weight of Western sanctions. It relied heavily on its national wealth fund, often referred to as President Vladimir Putin's war chest, for example, and worked on extending its trade relations with Asian nations like China and India, who have become the biggest buyers of Russian oil and gas since the war began. However, over time, as the cost of the war has spiraled and sanctions have intensified, Russia has begun to buckle under the pressure. The latest waves of European and US sanctions against the Kremlin have proven to be particularly effective, as they target not just Russia, but any country that continues to do business with it as well. As a result, even China and India, who had up to that point been so eager to do business with Moscow, have felt the sting and started to show real reluctance about investing any further in Russian resources. Back in September, for example, a Chinese bank made the call to officially stop accepting payments from Russia after falling foul of European Union sanctions. Meanwhile, in India, numerous importers began backing out of deals for Russian crude oil, not wanting to get on the West's bad side but continuing to support the Russian energy industry. These banks and businesses are unlikely to backtrack or change their minds, with one payment market source telling Reuters reporters, Chinese banks are afraid of being placed on sanctions list under secondary sanctions so they don't accept money from Russia. Facing the very real threat of financial ruin if it loses investment from India and China, Russia has been scrambling to find ways to work around these new sanctions, deciding that a back-to-basics bartering system is perhaps the only viable option for the time being. This is something that the Kremlin has been thinking about for quite some time. Back in 2024, the Russian Economy Ministry published a 14-page guide to foreign barter transactions, essentially advising businesses on how to use the barter system to evade sanctions and negotiate deals with foreign partners and suppliers. The ministry even spoke about creating a new trading platform that could function as a barter exchange space, making it easier for Russian businesses to do deals around the world. As the ministry's document notes, foreign trade barter transactions allow the exchange of goods and services with foreign companies without the need for international transactions. This in theory means that such transactions would be harder for Western countries to trace, which in turn makes it more difficult for them to dish out punishments for offending parties. In short, it's a way for Russian, Chinese and other businesses to continue exchanging goods and services without the shadow of sanctions looming overhead. For a long time, there were few signs of any major commercial interest in these sorts of transactions, and understandably so. As explained earlier, bartering is an outdated practice, and businesses today expect to be paid in cold, hard cash for the products or services they provide. Few would willingly engage in the intricacies of barter negotiations, which involve each side having to carefully calculate appropriate values and quantities of goods to exchange. The risk of unfair, imbalanced deals is particularly high when using the barter system, which is just one of the many reasons why the world moved on from it, literally thousands of years ago. However, given that it's fast becoming one of the only ways for entities outside of Russia to still do business with Moscow, interest in the practice has increased. Reuters reporters were, for instance, able to identify 8 examples of barter transactions taking place between Russia and its international trading partners. It wasn't able to establish specifics, like the exact volumes and values of the goods that changed hands, but insider sources admitted that the practice was becoming more frequent. Maxim Spassky, for example, the secretary of the General Council of the Russian-Asian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, admitted, "The growth of barter is a symptom of de-dollarization, sanctions pressure, and liquidity problems among partners." Spassky added that he expects barter volumes to increase in the weeks and months to come, while another source, who elected to remain anonymous for safety reasons, noted that this system was one of the only available options for Russian banks to effectively circumvent the sanctions that had severed them from dollar and euro transactions. Analysts also noted that the rising amount of barter transactions may explain recent discrepancies in Russian trade data, with central bank statistics showing widely different figures compared to the country's customs service. To be more precise, there was a $7 billion gap between the central bank and the customs service's data for the first half of 2025, which some analysts see as a clear sign of just how much Moscow is regressing towards a barter-based economy. One of the transactions identified by Reuters and confirmed by 2 separate sources involved Chinese automobiles being exchanged for Russian wheat. According to one of the sources, the Chinese sellers asked their Russian counterparts to pay them in grain in order to evade sanctions. Once both sides had agreed on values and quantities, the Chinese partners purchased the cars in China using yuan, while the Russian businesses bought grain using rubles. Then, the 2 sides exchanged their products with one another. Many of the other transactions followed a similar pattern, but with different goods. 2, for example, involved Russian flax seeds being exchanged for the likes of household appliances and construction materials from China. Experts with insider knowledge of Russian trade noted that the amount of flaxseed in one of those deals was worth around $100,000. Other transactions involved Russian metals being swapped for Chinese machines, raw materials being exchanged for Chinese services, and Russian aluminum being used to pay a Chinese company. While almost all of the deals identified involved China, one of them was also with Pakistan. In addition, while no specifics were shared, sources noted that some of these transactions have allowed certain Western goods to be imported into Russia. Such goods have largely been prohibited since the war began, with large numbers of Western brands leaving the Russian market soon after the invasion began in 2022. While this may seem like a viable way for Russia to work around the problems posed by sanctions, it's actually likely to cause more harm than good in the long run. And the Kremlin already has first-hand experience of dealing with the kind of chaos that bartering can bring. Back in the 1990s, for example, shortly after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, barter caused widespread havoc for the Russian economy. Vast and complicated chains of deals were established, involving everything from energy to food, clothing and more, and scammers took full advantage of the confusion, exploiting businesses and pocketing fortunes and profits. Back then, however, the lack of readily available currency, coupled with a high rate of inflation, made barter a relatively attractive proposition. These days, it's clear to see that barter is outdated and impractical in more ways than one, but has become a last resort tactic to cope with the increasingly heavy weight of Western sanctions. At the same time, barter isn't the only option. Some traders are opting for alternatives, like using so-called payment agents, who can facilitate payments between businesses inside and outside of Russia using various systems and schemes. However, working with such agents can be both costly and risky. Businesses might also elect to use the Russian state-owned VTB Bank, which is a branch in Shanghai, to facilitate the flow of funds between Russia and China. Or they can choose to use cryptocurrencies, as Sergei Putyatinsky, Vice President of Operations and IT at BCS, a Russian financial company, explains. Small businesses are actively using crypto. Some transport cash, some work through offsets, some diversify accounts with different banks. There is no ready-made technological answer yet. While Russian officials may want to put on a brave face and act like swapping stocks of grain and raw materials is a normal way for a major nation to behave in the 21st century, the rest of the world isn't fooled. This rapid regression to Stone Age trade strategy underscores the serious crisis facing the Kremlin today. In recent months, for example, statistics show that seaborne crude oil shipments through key Russian ports such as Primorsk and Ust-Luga have decreased dramatically. Primorsk, for example, used to see 9 or 10 tankers pass through it per week. Now it's down to just 3. Ust-Luga, meanwhile, once saw 12 or 13 tankers each week, but has seen that tally almost slashed in half, dropping to just 7 or 8 on average. Recent US sanctions on Russia's shadow fleet have also reduced the total number of available tankers that the country can call on to transport oil around the world, constraining its export capacities and triggering deep discounts on its most valuable in-demand resources like Urals crude, which is now more than $20 below Brent. On top of that, global oil prices have also been slipping, reaching just $63 per barrel for Brent and around $58 for WTI. As a result, Russia's net earnings per barrel are falling even further with every passing week, and its exporters have felt compelled to offer unprecedented discounts to importers in India and other nations just to get deals over the line and bring at least a little money. But even with such drastic measures, Russia's problems are still racking up. The government is currently looking at total oil and gas revenues that are around 35% lower than they were 12 months ago. As profits drop, banks both in and out of the country become even more reluctant to process payments, and even formerly reliable trade partners are set to refuse any deals involving the Russian ruble out of fears that even holding the currency could put them at threat of future sanctions or scrutiny. This all contributes to creating a situation in which Russia is going to find it increasingly hard to cover the cost of imports and makes the deals it needs to make. Some of its smaller businesses will likely be left by the wayside as costs spiral and deals become more difficult to finalize. And even bigger firms, like those in the military-industrial complex, may struggle to get the resources and materials they need to remain operational. For now, barter may seem to be a quick fix, giving businesses at least one way to bring important essential assets into the country. It also has the advantage of helping Russia go some way towards preserving the all-important trade relationships it needs to keep its economy afloat. Those very relationships would, more than likely, be broken beyond repair by now if barter and other alternative payment systems like crypto didn't exist. Goods-to-goods exchanges are a lifeline, a way for Russian businesses to keep critical supply chains moving, even as their country's entire financial system becomes increasingly restrictive and threatens to fall apart at the seams. But it's far from a flawless solution, and the more Russia is forced to rely on these sorts of deals, the more visible the problems with barter will become. Russian brands will, for example, find that many international firms are simply unwilling to engage in barter-based negotiations, as they don't suit their particular business models. Many also lack experience in this sort of trade, so will be cautious and reluctant to engage with it too deeply. Those that are willing to barter and have the necessary experience to do so could find ways to exploit Russia's weak standing, devising imbalanced deals that leave Russian brands much worse off than they would be if they were conducting a regular financial transaction. Conditions are already becoming increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for many Russian banks and businesses to operate in, thanks to the extortionate cost of the war with Ukraine and the cannibalization of many of Russia's industries by the military-industrial complex. If firms now have to learn the bizarre intricacies of an ancient commodity exchange system, it's only going to make their lives 10 times harder. The last thing many Russian business owners and CEOs want to be doing is working out exactly how much grain, flaxseed, or other random raw materials they need to buy and exchange in order to bring in vital components to keep their companies running correctly. It's too complicated, too chaotic, and for many, it will prove too much to bear. Unfortunately for them, bar a sudden and drastic change in fortunes, the situation is not going to get any better anytime soon. As long as the war rages on, sanctions will continue, and the EU is already weighing up its next moves, with plans in place to replace the price cap on Russian oil exports with a full and frank maritime services ban. This could completely end a huge part of the oil trade between Russia, India and China, forcing Russia to either abandon its war with Ukraine in a last desperate bid to survive, or somehow expand its shadow fleet to keep oil moving in sufficient quantities. But with recent sanctions also specifically targeting the shadow fleet, the country's oil industry is set to take a serious beating into 2026 and beyond. The EU has also agreed to permanently end all Russian gas imports and move towards phasing out Russian oil entirely as well. This will, at last, bring an end to Europe's dependence on Russian resources, with LNG imports set to end by December 31 of 2026 and pipeline gas stopping by September 30, 2027. Making this announcement, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stated, "Today, we enter the era of Europe's full energy independence from Russia. Repower EU has delivered. It shielded us from the worst energy crisis in decades, and it helped us to transition from Russian fossil fuels at record speed. Today, we're stopping these imports permanently. By depleting Putin's war chest, we stand in solidarity with Ukraine and set our sights on new energy partnerships and opportunities for the sector." This is extremely bad news for Russia. Sanctions are going to continue ramping up. Revenue and profits will inevitably decline, and even the industry and resources that Russia has relied on for years, like oil and gas, will no longer be the steady, stable sources of income and investment they once were. If this keeps up, the country could find itself forced back to the Stone Age in other ways beyond its embarrassing embrace of the barter system. Its people are already being cut off from international travel and trade, with their freedoms slowly stripped away by an increasingly paranoid and tyrannical government. The only question left is, how low will Russia sink before something finally changes? Now, you can learn more about the Kremlin's economic collapse in this video, which looks at how Ukraine's strategic long-range strikes have crippled refineries, shut down ports, and eliminated the oil revenue that Putin so desperately needs to keep his floundering war machine chugging along. Alternatively, check out our detailed hypothetical breakdown of what would happen if Ukraine were allowed to join the NATO alliance, and what it would mean for Putin's Russia, both now and in the future. And for more insightful, informative content regarding the Russia-Ukraine war and other important conflicts from around the world, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications too, so you can be the first to find out about the latest breaking news.